The media we consume has a huge impact on our perceptions of crime. Mainstream media was a big part of my life growing up because TV was the main news source for my parents. I'm sure it was like that for most people too. But just like people have biases, mainstream media outlets have biases as well. And those biases can determine how a news outlet is going to cover a particular story. So it follows that our perception of crime and our entire worldview will be shaped by the media that we are consuming. Authors Dana Mastro, Maria Knight Lipinski, Maria A. Kopax, and Elizabeth Bam Morowitz wanted to find out what ways the media can potentially influence one's perception of crime. So they got together and wrote an article, The Influence of Exposure to Depictions of Race and Crime in TV News on Viewers' Social Judgments. So how they went about their goal to show the influence of mainstream media was actually really interesting. They created a false news story about a sexual assault and edited 3 different versions of it. The only difference between each version was that one version showed a white suspect on screen, one showed a black suspect, and another didn't show a suspect at all. The researchers ultimately found that participants were more likely to assign guilt to the black male suspect shown over the white suspect. White male participants also often positively evaluated the white male suspect as opposed to the black male suspect. Though the sample size was relatively small, this article suggests that there is a level of influence that mainstream media has on the public's perception of crime. This ties into the idea that the media can also manufacture fear in our society. In the article Mental Disorder and Violence, an Empirical Picture and Context, authors David Pilgrim and Ann Rogers explored the perceived relationship between mental disorders and dangerousness in individuals. I'll use the homeless or unhoused population in Fresno as an example. The levels of homelessness in Fresno have dramatically increased since the pandemic, and you can see it anywhere in town when you drive around. And people tend to associate homeless population in Fresno with violence and drugs. But the reality is, if anyone were to lose their house and then lose their job, and then not afford to pay for their means of transportation, so they lose that too. And then they have to worry about what they're going to eat every day, where they're going to go, whether they're going to get assaulted today or the next day. You know, all of that anxiety and fear would likely put anyone in a really terrible mental state. So the only option for a lot of homeless people is to self-medicate through drugs. And that's probably why people view the unhoused with such stigma. But when it comes to drugs, there's not even enough evidence to suggest that they cause violence. For a lot of people, it's more of an escape from reality and from the mental state that they find themselves in. They don't have to be diagnosed with a mental disorder in order for people to assume that they have one, which is crazy. But it doesn't really matter either way. So Pilgrim and Rogers posit that a diagnosis of a mental disorder in an individual does not clearly point to an increased risk of violence in that individual. The point is that association that people make with homeless and violence is completely unwarranted. The idea that homeless people are violent drug abusers is just a completely made-up idea, and it only dehumanizes homeless people and pushes them even further away from society. As a matter of fact, dehumanizing people is the mainstream media specialty. When the war on drugs was first initiated, it almost seemed like yet another way to target the African American population. Tracy Carpenter mentions this in her article about the crack mother icon. After the war on drugs was instituted, a media campaign was started that targeted African Americans. Carpenter states that the media attention changed mainstream perceptions of users and dealers and set the stage for mass incarceration, criminalization, and demonization of the African American community. John Cura refers to this as the dehumanization process. It's the act of otherizing individuals in order to justify mistreatment or even severe violence against those individuals. And an example of this is just think of all the anti-LGBT legislation being passed in America today. This just shows what dehumanization process can allow people to do to others. So Cura brings up the fact that justification of violence can straight up become part of a cultural tradition. And you can even see that kind of attitude when you're looking at the Fresno Police Department's arrest statistics. So despite Black people making up about 6% of the population in Fresno in 2014, they accounted for almost 20% of all arrests made that year. That number is wildly disproportionate to the population of African Americans in Fresno. It's just insane. So all of these ideas brought up by all of these authors, Carpenter, Curra, and the BJS, is so important because they're all connected to each other. There are so many different groups of people being marginalized by the system in the same exact way. So understanding intersectionality as a concept and applying it to how we interact with the world will help us to see just that. So I want to talk about how all of this relates to deviance and theoretical perspectives on deviance. The theoretical perspective on deviance that best describes the influence of mainstream media on the social perceptions of crime and deviant behavior is symbolic interactionism. So according to this article, symbolic interactionism is a theoretical approach that can be used to explain how societies and or social groups come to view behaviors as deviant or conventional. In other words, there are many different theories within symbolic interactionism that explore deviant behavior and how communities will assign deviance to other people. In this particular case, labeling theory shows that the public's reaction to behavior is what constitutes deviance, not the action itself. This can be tied back to mainstream media because if, say, a prominent news actor was to label someone as deviant for any reason, they then could influence the entire public into thinking that behavior is deviant, or at least a vast majority of the public. So mainstream media has an incredible amount of power and influence over society, and they can define anything that they want as deviant. And understanding this fact is important as we become more aware of the media that we consume every day.